Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Dauphiny. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and it is my pleasure to start taking over these author talks that Cindy Warwick used to put together. She recently retired, so I will be taking over her programming moving forward. So I just like to thank everybody for attending and also for our speaker, Paul Soltis, for agreeing to speak with us today. We do have some upcoming webinars which may be of interest to you. On January 23rd is Keeping Your New Year's Resolutions. And then on the 25th is Social Security 101. And February 1st is on Identity Theft. So if you would like to register for any of them, you can visit our website. Our next author talk is for Black History Month and is on February 23rd at noon with Dr. George Pruitt, who is President Emeritus of Thomas Edison State University. He will be discussing his book, From Protest to President, A Social Justice Journey Through the Emergency of Adult Education and the Birth of Distance Learning. So if you have time, we would love for you to attend us there. But today we have with us Paul Soltis, who is the State Park Services Resource Interpretative Specialist at the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage State Historic Sites in Somerville, New Jersey. Paul holds a BA from William and Mary and a certificate from the National Institute of American History and Democracy in Williamsburg, Virginia. Some of what he will share is on how two royal jubilees bookend the 125 years of historic preservation at the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage. So welcome, Paul. I think we're all very excited for what you have to share, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon. All right, thanks for joining us today for this exploration of 125 years of historic preservation at New Jersey's Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage. This afternoon's program really concludes our 125th anniversary year. The Wallace House opened as an historic house museum in 1897, which made 2022, of course, the 125th anniversary year. And although our usual focus, if you hear talks from me or come to visit us in Somerville, is on the years of the American Revolution and on the use of the Wallace House as George Washington's winter headquarters during the Middlebrook Cantonment, the winter of 1778 to 79, when the Continental Army camped in Somerset County, and the Old Dutch Parsonage as the home of ministers of the Dutch Reformed Church, including the founder and first president of Rutgers. This program will kind of take us the story afterwards. What happened after Washington's departure, and how did this house become a museum, and how can these two homes show us one New Jersey case study of the larger process of museum making and historic preservation, and how that has changed over 125 years since 1897. So thanks for coming along. The photograph that we see here on our opening slide is an early photograph of the Wallace House from the Revolutionary Memorial Society of New Jersey, the organization that first preserved the house in 1897. And this is from a pamphlet produced just the following year, 1898, and gives us a really good sense of what the house looked like at the time of its initial preservation. Taking a look at Washington's headquarters in central New Jersey is a really interesting and rich subject. Recently, Mr. Patrick Murray of the Crossroads of the American Revolution Association did the math and determined that George Washington spent 1 out of every 5 nights of the Revolutionary War at one of these 3 historic homes that we have listed here, the Ford Mansion in Morristown, Wallace House in Somerville, and Rockingham, previously in Rocky Hill and today in Kingston, just outside of Princeton. Today, two of them are state parks, Wallace House State Historic Site and Rockingham State Historic Site. And the third, the Ford Mansion, is part of Morristown National Historical Park, which includes the mansion in town and Jockey Hollow, the grounds on which the Continental Army encamped during that Morristown encampment, the winter following the Middlebrook encampment at the Wallace House. With this really rich corridor, we get to see right here in central New Jersey how interest in Washington, interest in Washington's headquarters during the Revolution informed the early historic preservation movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we'll start off our usual starting point, of course, is Washington's headquarters at the Wallace House. And as some introduction, the Wallace House was a pretty new structure when General Washington came to stay here in 1778. The home was constructed by a Scottish merchant from Philadelphia named John Wallace. Mr. Wallace wanted to get away from the Revolutionary War. He could sense the revolutionary ferment brewing at home in Philadelphia, and he thought that his money could insulate him. So he bought 95 acres of land out in Somerset County. He called his new property Hope Farm, perhaps hoping to escape the Revolutionary War, and he proceeded to construct the largest home built during the Revolutionary War in New Jersey. Not many people are building at all during wartime, let alone on such a large scale. Of course, moving to the middle of New Jersey to escape the Revolutionary War was not a prescient idea on Mr. Wallace's part, and in fact would bring him right at to the crossroads of the American Revolution. By the fall of 1778, the Continental Army had chosen the surrounding Middlebrook region for their winter encampment, and John Wallace was approached about the rental of his own home as the commander-in-chief's headquarters. George Washington was in residence here for 2 weeks in December the 12th to 21st of 1778. He would leave camp over the Christmas tide season and through the month of January, where he had meetings with Congress in Philadelphia and his all-important reunion for the winter with Martha Washington. And together, George and Martha Washington returned to the Wallace House on February the 5th. And they would remain in residence through the winter and into the spring until June the 3rd, when the entire Middlebrook cantonment broke up. As I mentioned, this period is our usual focus, but for today, I'd like to step beyond that period and see what happens after George Washington leaves Hope Farm and the house returns to the full possession of the Wallace family. When John Wallace moved up to Hope Farm, he was accompanied by his wife, Mary Maddox, and his mother-in-law, his wife, Mary Wallace, and his mother-in-law, her mother, Mary Maddox. The portraits here, we have John Wallace depicted at the center. To the left is Mrs. Wallace, and to the right is Mrs. Maddox. And the three of them made up the family that was present at Hope Farm during the years of the American Revolution. They also brought with them from Philadelphia enslaved servants. We know the names of at least two of them, a woman named Phyllis and a young man named Greg. And of course, war brings uncertainty to all levels of society, but only all that much more exacerbated for those who do not have a choice in the direction that they will take during the war. When John Wallace decided he would leave Philadelphia, those people he enslaved did not have a choice in that decision to leave the city. And we don't know what family or friends they left behind in the process. And with the uncertainties of war, not knowing when, if ever, they would be able to reunite again. When George Washington rented the house from the Wallace family, the family remained in residence. So this was a case where the family and the military family lived side by side. Following Washington's departure, however, the family again took full possession of the house at Hope Farm. And although Mr. Wallace had intended it as a country seat and place of retirement, he really would not live to see Hope Farm in peacetime. He died in 1783 the very end of the Revolutionary War, as did his mother-in-law, Mary Maddox, who at the time, if we can trust the records of her birth in Burlington in 1681, was over 100 years old. Mrs. Wallace would follow the following year and died early in 1784, again, just after the definitive Treaty of Paris had brought the Revolutionary War to its formal conclusion. Their youngest son would take over ownership of the house at Hope Farm, but he also died young, around the age of 33, and he died just in the opening years of the new century of the 1800s. At that time, there were surviving siblings. He had surviving brothers and sisters. However, none of them apparently were interested in taking on the ownership of the house and estate at Hope Farm. And as such, the home was sold pretty early on in the process out of the Wallace family. So although we today call it Wallace House, because it was the Wallace House at the time of George Washington's headquarters, it will really only be for a few brief decades that there were Wallaces living in this structure. In the next century, we can see the house shift from what was really a gentleman's country retreat into an actual kind of working farm. John Wallace was a Scottish emigrant born in the lowlands of Scotland. He first came to America, to Newport, Rhode Island. And like many second sons of Scots, he would take up trade as a merchant in North America. And this was a way where he could basically make his own fortune independent of any of his own family's position. He's not the descendant of a nobleman. You often hear about that, the idea that, well, a nobleman, the title is entailed to the eldest son, and as such, all the fortune in the state is entailed to that eldest son as well. But he was the son of a church minister. And according to the church records, we know that his eldest brother, the eldest son, took on the ministry of that church after his father died. So though it's not quite the same as the wholesale inheritance of a landed country estate, it was in effect the same process. Father held the pulpit, and after his death, the eldest son takes it on. So John Wallace found this opportunity in North America, first in Newport, Rhode Island, and then eventually in Philadelphia. We know he traded in fabric, according to some of the advertisements found in the Philadelphia newspapers. And it was that fortune that really funded his activity and his life at Hope Farm. If there's any farming going on, it'd be probably on a small scale and probably done by tenant farmers who are free persons themselves, but who don't own property, who would rent out land from a landholder like John Wallace. By the 19th century, however, the house will change from this gentleman's country retreat into a true working farm. Then the next family to take ownership was a family called the Millers. We know that the Millers kept an apple cider still on their property. Here I found an image of a cider still, not from our Jersey, but from the Isle of Jersey, on this kind of vintage Jersey stamp, with Her Majesty the Queen there on the right-hand side, and she'll come up in our story later, kind of to give a sense of what that cider making operation looked like at Hope Farm in the early 19th century too. New Jersey was especially known for her apple orchards in the 18th and 19th century, and as a result for the apple cider that came from them. Most homes in colonial America would brew beer at seasonal times of year, but it was in this mid-Atlantic region, especially New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania, that cider was really the big drinking produce that came from the crop. After the Millers, the farm was sold to a family called Cooper, and it would really be under the ownership of Mr. Cooper that the first efforts were made to preserve the Wallace House for its historic significance in 1897. With the formation of an organization called the Revolutionary Memorial Society, the Wallace House really was not a house for very long, if you will. So by that I mean, remember, it was built in the opening years of the Revolutionary War in 1776, 1777. The period of major significance would follow just soon after, 1778 to 79, when it served as Washington's headquarters. And within the next century, by 1897, the house was purchased and preserved as an historic site. So this is actually relatively early in that turn of the century historic preservation movement, but certainly in keeping with a growing interest in the nation at that time. The Revolutionary Memorial Society, as the name suggests, kind of had grand visions at its outset. It was going to preserve not just the Wallace House, but collections of historic sites throughout New Jersey. And in fact, it originally had its eyes set not on the Washington's headquarters at the Wallace House, but Washington's headquarters just a little bit further south in Rocky Hill at Rockingham House. Rockingham was George Washington's headquarters at the very end of the Revolutionary War, from August 23rd to November 10th of 1783. It was while in residence at Rockingham that Congress, meeting at Philadelphia, received the word of the final Treaty of Paris, bringing the war to its formal conclusion, and that General Washington wrote and dispatched his farewell orders to the armies of the United States, making clear his intentions to retire from public life and to resign his position as commander-in-chief now that the war has come to its conclusion. In the years that followed, Rockingham came into the ownership of the Rocky Hill Quarry Company, and the Quarry Company began mining that Rocky Hill, right, for which the town had taken its name. For a time, the house served as a quarry master's residence, and actually would also serve as a barracks for quarry employees, who were primarily Italian immigrants and Italian Americans. The Revolutionary Memorial Society was interested in preserving the house for its historic connection to George Washington. However, the Quarry Company offered a catch. Although they were willing to part with the house itself, they were not willing to part with the land on which it sat. They wanted to incorporate that land into their growing quarry. The Revolutionary Memorial Society decided they didn't want to deal with that. If they were going to buy a house, they wanted it on its original spot, on its original foundations. However, they had dissenters, and some of their dissenters separated from the Revolutionary Memorial Society and formed another organization, the Washington's Headquarters Association. And the Washington's Headquarters Association made an agreement separately with the Rocky Hill Quarry Company, by which the house was purchased, relocated a few hundred yards from its original location, and that way they could operate the Rockingham House as an historic museum, and the Quarry Company could take over the property and expand their quarry operation. Rockingham is today on the New Jersey Women's Heritage Trail, not because of any of its 18th century history, not because of any women there in the American Revolution period, but because of the women involved in its early preservation. And although not exclusively a women's organization, the Washington's Headquarters Association was largely led by women. In this case, we have the sign here marking Kate McFarland and Josephine Swan, who were the major leaders of this movement. And I'm sorry that the sign here is a little bit blurry, but basically at the bottom you see a quotation in which Josephine Swan and Kate McFarland are reflecting that they settled on a price for the house and not the land, which was fine because it was the house we were after and not the property itself. Today, we would see this as a huge loss to lose the original location of the house, not only because of the importance of the landscape and context, but also the archaeological resources that can be contained within those lands. We'll talk a little bit later about that process as well, and those changing views at the Wallace House and its preservation movement too. Women would figure in many of these historic preservation movements, most famously beginning with George Washington's own home at Mount Vernon, which was preserved by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, and it remains the Mount Vernon Ladies Association who preserve and operate Mount Vernon as an historic site today. Part of the social history behind this is you have in this era, the late 19th and early 20th century, many of these upper class women who, because of the fortunes that support them, have time for leisure, have time to pursue their interests, but because of the barrier of sex, they are not able to participate in the professions of their era. So women who might be interested in art or history or the new fields of archaeology, they cannot get the official trainings and credentials of universities because of the simple fact that they are women. They are not welcome in professional life, in professional academic work. But historic preservation and historic sites was kind of seen as an acceptable midway, a way that a woman could demonstrate and exercise her interests, but without entering professional life. And so many of the historic sites or art museums, or even in cases parks that we see preserved in this period, if you often trace the histories of their preservation, you'll find women of fortune who took on these causes as ways to exercise their interests, and very capable interests in these subjects. Returning back up to Wallace House in Somerville, the Revolutionary Memorial Society turned its attention to the Wallace House. And here, I suppose they found a Washington's headquarters that they would not need to move, and that they could keep in its original location. And they came to a price of sale with Mr. Cooper, the last private owner of the house, and executed a mortgage. And in 1897, took on full ownership of the Wallace House and the surrounding property. Now, at this time, it was no longer 95 acres. That had since been divided up, but was still a little bit larger than the property that remains part of the State Park Service today. When they opened the house as a museum in 1897, it was, of course, covered in the news of the local newspaper. Here's the Unionist Gazette, the newspaper for Somerville, and its front page story is the Wallace House. The opening exercises held on Thursday, the numerous revolutionary relics now in the various rooms. So they feature the opening of the house as a museum in June of 1897, and in particular, they're highlighting the notion of these revolutionary relics. This is an era, again, before professional cataloging and collection. And many times, once the house is preserved, they don't necessarily furnish it as an historic house museum that we would think of today. This notion that you enter the historic house and you see roughly what the house might have looked like at the time of its major period of significance. Instead, these early houses were really shrines. They were meant to be places of storing relics. And if we think of pilgrimage, and we think of relics of saints as kind of a tradition out of a Roman Catholic faith, or out of the medieval Catholic Church, of which these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants stood in opposition, in a way they kind of were making a Protestant version of that tradition. They don't go to the great cathedrals of Europe to venerate the relics of a saint, but they do go to their great historic shrines of America to, in a sense, venerate the relics of their founding fathers, of the men, especially the great white men in particular, who founded the United States in the American Revolution. And they use this language of relics, as you see right here, in describing that process. And we'll discuss that a little bit too further. Coincidentally, the third column here mentions the second major news story that day, and that was Queen Victoria's reign. A discourse was delivered by the local Reformed Church minister on Queen Victoria for the occasion of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. King George III, who had reigned in Great Britain at the time of the American Revolution, was in his own lifetime the longest reigning British monarch. He celebrated 50 years on the throne and almost made it to 60 years, although by that time he was in retirement from public life due to his mental illness. I think died just about in the 59th year of his reign. Queen Victoria would break King George III's record and celebrated this occasion with what was called a Diamond Jubilee in 1897, marking 60 years on the throne. And although obviously by this time New Jersey is no longer a colony of Great Britain, Queen Victoria as queen and empress was seen as a model to especially these Christian faiths throughout the world. And that is what this on this occasion, by the local Reformed church preacher in Somerville would offer a sermon in celebration of Queen Victoria and her Christian piety for this occasion. Like any organization preserving an historic site, very early the Revolutionary Memorial Society set to work on sharing the history. And many of these efforts show their efforts not too dissimilar to what we do today, that by sharing the history, you get more people interested, and in turn, you get more supporters. And they're always looking for more supporters, more help to preserve, to furnish, and to protect the Wallace House, to join in this project of historic preservation. This little description of the Wallace House comes from an essay or a pamphlet for a lecture that was given at the Lyceum in Newark in 1898, so 1 year into the official opening of the Wallace House Museum. And this lecture was a fundraiser for the Wallace House effort, and also an attempt to share the history to get more people interested. And as we see, the society has renovated the house there towards the very bottom, with very many relics of revolutionary times presented to us by patriotic citizens. So it's not so much that they're trying to collect things to make the house look like it did in a particular year. They're collecting relics. They're collecting things associated with these great figures, as they see it, of the Revolutionary War. Just above it, you can also see this phrase, the workmanship of the house is of the most substantial character. And this is another phrase that appears in a lot of this period, what's called the Colonial Revival, this renewed interest in the colonial period of American history, broadly speaking, which they pretty much considered everything from the arrival of Columbus up to the Civil War. They didn't really have a strict definition of colonial as the 18th or 19th century. It relates to this sense of a modern world, a world in the midst of industrial revolution, that kind of with the mechanization and machinery of our modern world, we're losing a lot of the handmade work of crafts and trades of an earlier time. And so you'll very much often see that the workmanship of is something that makes the preservation of these colonial houses worthwhile. And we see as well, there is a mortgage of $3,000 still remaining. So they paid $3,000 up front and had a mortgage of $3,000 remaining. And we do have in our archives at the Wallace House the original mortgage paper, which is pretty cool, which has basically the countdown as over the next few decades, they paid off the mortgage slowly, obtaining full title to the house from Mr. Albert Cooper. But they weren't just sharing the history, they had to argue the history too. We know they got some stuff wrong, but they got some stuff right too. One of the issues when they first set about preserving the Wallace House was they faced questions about whether or not this even was Washington's headquarters. It was largely known that yes, George Washington had a headquarters here in the Middlebrook region, but whether or not it was in this particular house or in another house that might no longer stand, that remained a question of debate. And the Revolutionary Memorial Society, in many of their early lecture efforts, is honing in on that question, making the case that, yes, we've got the right house. We've got Washington's headquarters. As simple a question as that might sound, it was something that they still had to prove and figure out. So 1, 2, 3 paragraphs in here, the third full paragraph you see. This is from a 1930s era pamphlet. The authenticity of the place as having been used by General Washington as his headquarters is established by the affidavits of old residents and by the following publication taken from the Royal Gazette. So even a few decades into their operation of the house as a museum, they're still at a point where they're making the case, continually arguing that, yep, we've got the right place. This is Washington's headquarters. This is a cause that is worth supporting. Other details we know they got wrong. They misunderstood who was the owner of the house at the time of Washington's stay. They refer to John Wallace as the builder of the house, and then his son, William Wallace, as the owner of the house at the time of Washington's headquarters. But they misread or misunderstood the time of John Wallace's death. They believed he died before the war, and we know that that's not true, that John Wallace was very much alive during the Revolutionary War, and that it was he who rented out the house, not his son, William, who would take it on later. We also see, in a very grim but important sense, changing approaches to historical interpretation and inclusion of perspectives in history. And in the second paragraph here, we have mention of the Sullivan campaign, which was planned from the Wallace House. And in the phrasing of this era, it was in this building that the plans were completed and the expedition determined, upon which sent General Sullivan to the Wyoming Valley to conquer the turbulent Indians. What is true is that from the Wallace House, George Washington planned an expedition often called the Sullivan Campaign, as was led by General Sullivan, who was also here in New Jersey, who was an important player in the crossing and the 10 Crucial Days and the First Battle of Trenton. And this was a campaign against, in particular, the 5 of the 6 nations of the Iroquois in upstate New York, who had allied with the British cause at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and were leading raids on white American settlements in that region, settlements aligned with the revolutionary cause. Washington's response was a really severe campaign that targeted not only military assets, but also the civilian settlements of these Indian nations, as well as civilian populations. And so, like so many of these issues, whereas in the era of this pamphlet's publication, at least by the, again, largely white Anglo-Saxon Protestant historians who published it, it's a very clear and easy thing to just refer simply to those turbulent Indians as a force menacing the American nation. We today bring a new perspective and recognize the damage that the campaign caused, and also the misunderstandings and the full nationhood that our United States composes today, including all these forces, no matter which sides in particular they may have taken at the time of the American Revolution. And right, not only have they established a museum, but as we've already referred to, they are furnishing a museum, or really more particularly furnishing a shrine. On the page on the right-hand side here, 1 paragraph down, we've got the house stands today exactly as it stood in those old days when it was occupied by Washington, with the exception that we understand that the front porch is of later origin. Sometime when we get enough money, it is hoped to remove this porch and to restore the front of the house to its original appearance. And in fact, that would happen, and the porch has been removed from the front of the Wallace House. The house is filled with a large and valuable collection of old and authenticated things in use in those early days, nearly all of the things bearing the names of the old families presenting them, and short statements of their history. And this notion, right, that part of the value of the artifact is not just the artifact itself, but the families who have given it. So these are kind of the great elite families of New Jersey, many of them, who are taking their own family heirlooms and placing them on display here at the Wallace House, so it can become a kind of shrine of a bygone era. and some interesting references to a few of the specific objects that visitors found, or at least what they were purported to be, if you had visited the Wallace House in these early days. Among the many things of note is the red coat worn by Colonel Rawl at the time he was killed in the Battle of Trenton. Well, that seems quite a claim to make, that the Wallace House was in possession of not only Colonel Rawl's coat, but in fact the coat he wore when he was wounded and mortally wounded during the Battle of Trenton on December 26, 1776. This coat came through the ownership of the Frelinghuysen family, who were involved nearby at the old Dutch parsonage. And the claim was that Frederick Frelinghuysen had somehow either received as a gift or as a prize of victory the coat of Colonel Rawl. The coat, at least the object that is claimed to be Colonel Rawl's coat, is today part of the Swan Foundation collection, much of which is on exhibit at Washington Crossing State Park today. And whether or not this particular coat was Colonel Rawl's is at this point in time probably impossible to prove either way. But interesting to understand how important these connections were to individuals, these claims that we have something with an individual connection. The next line here, another is the army trunk, a huge affair of iron and wood, about 10 feet long, which General Washington used during his years of campaigning, and which is beyond price. Now, General Washington's possessions, he was very careful with the accounting of not only his papers, but also his supplies during the war, many of which would return home to Mount Vernon following the war, and today are either in the collections at Mount Vernon or at the Smithsonian Institution. Is it possible he missed a few, and that some are on display in these museums today? Who knows whether or not this trunk really belonged to George Washington, but that was the claim that was made of it. And what does all this relic making add up to? It adds up to a sense of pilgrimage, that in an era, again, of industrial revolution, of a changing world, those who visited historic shrines like these felt that somehow by visiting the places where these great men like George Washington had walked, and being near the things that they had used or touched or worn, you might be able to kind of commune with them and gain some sense of the values of an era gone by. And very often those values were understood as a sense of simplicity, a sense of patriotism, a sense of commitment to patriotic cause. That was seen in contrast to the modern era, which was felt to be so overwhelmed by business and industry that kind of individuals were being lost in this kind of messy world of the present. The Revolutionary Memorial Society also added a new structure to the building. Here on the second paragraph, we see the construction of a commodious cottage on the grounds for the use of the caretaker. The society has not been able to finance other projects, but they have at least been able to construct this caretaker's cottage. And here is a picture of the Wallace House today. And just to the right of the Wallace House proper, before you reach the small little tree there, it would have been in front of that larger tree to the back, is where the caretaker's cottage stood. This cottage was, as the pamphlet shows, constructed in the early 1900s. It was in the arts and crafts style and was really an interesting artifact and piece of art of the arts and crafts era. In later years, in the 1980s, I think it was, by the time the house had come in the ownership of the state of New Jersey, a decision was made to demolish the caretaker's cottage and remove it from the site. It was not a decision without debate. In argument in favor of the demolition of the caretaker's cottage was the notion that, first of all, it was in a state of disrepair that could not be justified fixing, but also that it was not appropriate to the 18th century house. If we're going to furnish this place and present it as the Wallace House in the 18th century, we can't have these more recent buildings sitting right next door to it. It takes away from the authenticity, the accuracy of the interpretation. However, others argued for its preservation, saying that yes, although it is not an artifact of the 18th century, it is now an artifact of its own right, of the arts and crafts movement and its importance to American architectural history. And the arts and crafts movement was, much like those references showed, aiming sort of in a similar vein, interested in that idea of workmanship, in that idea of restoring the vision of individual craftsmen and craftswomen, and their contributions. That even in a mechanized age, there is room for individual imagination and creativity. So although the caretaker's cottage is now gone, it's an interesting part of the history to consider of how approaches change over time to preservation and what makes an artifact. On a related kind of level, just beyond the Wallace House today is a street that the Revolutionary Memorial Society laid out, appropriately enough called Washington Place. And you see here 3 of the homes that are part of the Washington Place neighborhood. Several more continue behind the Wallace House here from the vantage from which we are looking. And these homes were built by the Revolutionary Memorial Society in the early 1900s as well. Basically, where these homes stand were the barns and outbuildings and smokehouses that were so essential, the outbuilding structures, so essential to daily life at Hope Farm in the 18th century. The Revolutionary Memorial Society was not interested in that kind of element of the house's history, and as such sold off that land and constructed the homes here. They should help finance and fundraise for their preservation efforts in the house proper. Again, today, this is seen as such a huge loss, but let's put ourselves in the mind of the era. And first of all, the one reality is that they were not interested in what we today call social history or an inclusive history of all people involved in the history of a place. They were particularly interested in the great white men, in particular, men like George Washington. And as such, it is the home of George Washington that interests them, not the barns and outbuildings that surround it. And that is a real element, we must admit, as we approach historiography and how we now approach history in the present day and try to undo a lot of those mistakes. But also, in fairness to them, we have 2 other elements I think we need to remember. One is that when we think of a place like a barn or an outbuilding, we today think of archaeology. Wow, here's where we can go in and dig and see the waste that's left behind. And therein, we get a lot of great insight into who were all the people who lived here, the family in the house, and servants, hired and enslaved, who may have lived and worked here, and what were the life ways that made life here possible. But historical archaeology really did not even exist as a field at this time. It was emerging and would really enter the mainstream with the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg, the restoration funded by John Rockefeller Jr. In the 1920s and especially in the 1930s. Before this time, archaeology and history were totally separate disciplines. History is what is used to study documented history, documents at least as understood by Western scholars, things that are written down. Archaeology is used to understand civilizations for which no documentation survives, whether that be classical civilization like ancient Egypt or prehistoric civilizations in other parts of the world like Native America, or even ancient time periods like the Stone Ages, right? Those were different fields of study. Historical archaeology brought these 2 together. And when they started the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg, when they set about taking Williamsburg, Virginia, and bringing it back to its appearance in the 18th century, when it was the colonial capital of Virginia, they said, well, look, we can use documents to know who were the people who lived here and what did their houses look like. But we can also use archaeology too, and we can try to find foundations of their buildings, see what kind of artifacts they left behind. Some of their stuff might still be in the ground where they left it, either in a trash deposit or in another circumstance, and brings those two together. So now it is just such a natural thought that we use archaeology to explore a place like the Wallace House. But back then, it was just not even thought of that you could preserve the farmland and that it would have its own treasures to reveal to help inform the main place at two. And one of the phrases used is transition from landmark to landscape. Whereas these early efforts were focused on landmarks, historians increasingly today are interested in the landscapes that surround them and how that larger understanding can inform our sense of history. On another level, we have to remember how commonplace farms and agriculture was in this era. 20 years later, in 1921, about a mile away at the home of U.S. Senator Joseph Frelinghuysen, the U.S. President Warren G. Harding would sign the Knox-Porter Resolution, a resolution officially ending U.S. involvement in World War I. And that's a whole other lecture on its own right. But I only bring it in here today to mention that on the occasion of the signing of that resolution, a reporter from the New York Tribune mentioned that from the hill, from Senator Frelinghuysen's home, about a mile from the Wallace House, one could look down the little valley and see Washington's headquarters, that is the Wallace House, and then see the campground of the Continental Army just beyond it. If you visit this area of New Jersey today, you will not get that uninterrupted view. You will be looking from a P.C. Richards and a Burger King through the Somerville Circle, through the development of Somerville Town. It's a much more crowded and highly developed area today. But it's a reminder that not only as far back as the 18th century, but even as far back as just 100 years ago, how rural in nature and character this part of New Jersey was. And the notion that you have to preserve a barn or preserve a smokehouse must have seemed as ridiculous to them as if we today said, you know, we really need to think about how we're going to preserve Starbuckses, right? Or how we're going to preserve these warehouses we see in New Jersey today too. They're just everywhere. And the notion that at some point in the future they will be scarce was just probably incomprehensible. So there's where we do get, in fairness to them, the notion of preserving farms. We've got farms everywhere, you know, to their minds. Why would we need to do something like that? We're here to preserve something that is rare, which is 18th century historic houses. So we see too how what you have surviving also affects what you in a particular generation deem as worthy of preservation. And then finally, those questions about what is worth preserving, right? We mentioned the debate over the caretaker's cottage, and we're not even in a position at this time to take over these homes. But if, say, the state was able to buy the homes that stand next to us at the Wallace House, what would we do with them? Would we remove them, right, in the name of 18th century authenticity and accuracy? Would we preserve them as they are now historic artifacts in their own right? They are evidence of the Colonial Revival style of architecture, and they are part of the history of the preservation of this home. Colonial Williamsburg, again, offers a great example for comparison in the broad sense. We think of the gardens at Colonial Williamsburg today. And during the period of restoration, the Williamsburg restoration set out to lay out these beautiful gardens, which they saw as borrowing from the traditions of the 18th century. Today, however, we know that these gardens are nothing like the gardens that adorned at least the majority of houses in Williamsburg in the 18th century, with their low fences so you can look right over, and their kind of whimsical arrangements of plantings. But the gardens are now themselves artifacts of American garden history. They were hugely influential to our American aesthetic, not only in museum, but beyond. Anytime you put kind of a wreath, using natural materials out on your home at Christmas time. You're unknowingly or not really borrowing from traditions developed in the gardens of Colonial Williamsburg. Would we remove the gardens out altogether? Do we preserve them as historic artifacts? But does that diminish from the central mission of the 18th century? These are the interesting questions that we face as we decide, well, what to carry on, what to preserve, what to let go. And in a small way, these kind of homes of Washington Place or our caretaker's cottage engage at our local level the same questions that we see broadly in those more national conversations at the big museums like Colonial Williamsburg. Here's a little look at one of the early constitutions of the Revolutionary Memorial Society. And I like to put out, it includes their insignia, which so many of these early groups would put together, kind of a badge of some kind that the members would wear. Appropriately, this one is buff and blue, borrowing from the colors of Washington's Continental Army uniform that were in turn adopted as the colors of the state of New Jersey that we see on our New Jersey state flag today. And they were always recruiting members to join their society as well. I'd like to point out in this pamphlet here two paragraphs that show almost how little has changed. The foregoing is written in the hope that there will be more public knowledge and appreciation of the important bearing which the Wallace House and the Middlebrook encampments and the surrounding territory had in connection with the War of the Revolution, and how large a part they played in making our own United States a possibility. Well, this sounds just like what I'm doing right now here, and so much of what we in the State Park Service and our friends in the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association do today. We share the history, we try to get it out there, and we hope in turn that by doing that, we'll be able to bring more support for the preservation efforts to the cause as well. And the last paragraph in this pamphlet, we hope that the public will appreciate that the Wallace House is open, absolutely free, at all reasonable hours, with a competent caretaker and guide at the service of the visitor, a statement which, as the caretaker and guide, I humbly hope remains applicable to this day. The members are doing the best that they can, but they need more members, and more members will lend a helping hand. Separately was preserved the Old Dutch Parsonage with the efforts of Senator Joseph Frelinghuysen and the Frederick Frelinghuysen chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Both historic homes were donated together to the state of New Jersey in 1947. New Jersey's first state historic site was actually the Indian King Tavern in Haddonfield, which had to go up for a referendum because it wasn't even clear, can the state buy historic sites? New Jersey established its first state forests in 1905 and its first state parks in 1923, 100 years ago this year. But our state historic sites actually precede all those in terms of the state buying and collecting these things. Although not formally furnished as such or established a state park service until later. In 1970, on the first Earth Day, New Jersey established a Department of Environmental Protection. And here is an image of the quilt that was put together by DEP in 2020 for our 50th birthday. So Earth Day is birthday for DEP in New Jersey and combines both the functions of regulation and waste cleanup and remediation, as well as conservation and stewardship, including state parks, forests, and historic sites. So since 1947, the Wallace House has been a public and private partnership since the Revolutionary Memorial Society handed over the house as a gift to the state of New Jersey. And that's another thing you see in many of these historic preservation efforts. They're often preserved by private groups initially. That initial generation passes away. The financial restrictions of the Depression come on, and they'll be handed off to a government, whether like the Ford Mansion to the federal government, or like Rockingham and Wallace House to the state government. I often lament that although that was very kind of them to hand off the buildings to the state, these groups never thought to add an endowment when they made those gifts. They never thought, well, how is the state going to pay for it? And again, in fairness to them, in the 1930s and 1940s, in the era of the New Deal and the Second World War and the mass mobilization of the federal government, both in the war efforts, but also in conservation and in preservation, it was probably impossible to imagine that there would ever be a budget shortfall. The state would always have money. It was such an easy fix. We can't raise the funds ourselves, hand it off to the state. It'll be easy for them to pay for this into the future. Whether or not you think state functions should be, that's a discussion for another day. But just something to keep in mind in that era of the New Deal, that that we would have a future where we'd have these kind of pared down systems and budget shortfalls that made limited resources available for these kinds of conservation and preservation efforts was just probably unthinkable, for better or worse, whether one agreed with it or not, in the 1930s and 40s, to see how the situation could change. So in fairness, they didn't give an endowment because it seemed like such an easy fix. Well, of course, the taxpayer will always be able to foot the bill. It'll be a really simple process. And that remains what is today a private-public partnership, as in so many. The Friends of Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage, incorporated in 1974, and today called the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association, they really picked up where the Revolutionary Memorial Society at the Wallace House and the Frederick Frelinghuysen chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution at the Old Dutch Parsonage left off. And this year, in 2022, celebrated 125 years of civic involvement in historic preservation. We started with the mention of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee at the opening of the Wallace House as a museum. Well, by coincidence, our 125th anniversary fell during the Platinum Jubilee of the late Queen Elizabeth II. And so we timed our anniversary celebrations as a kind of miniature jubilee. We invited Queen Victoria for a living history presentation during the Jubilee weekend, and George Washington as well, to offer his remembrance of Middlebrook. And in celebration, I rode away to the palace, and we received a nice acknowledgement from the Queen, sent from Balmoral Castle over the summer, commending the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association for their ongoing voluntary efforts and acknowledging this fun coincidence of the two jubilees. The letter from Balmoral Castle, of course, all the more significant, as it would be just about a month and a half later, that the demise of the Queen took place at that Scottish country retreat. And the Wallace House, of course, was historically the home of a Scottish emigrant. And another way to mark the anniversary occasion, we'd planned to plant in 2020 a seedling of New Jersey's historic Salem oak in celebration of the Department of Environmental Protection's 50th birthday at the Wallace House. The Salem oak grew in the Salem Friends Burial Ground in South Jersey and finally fell in 2019, but had grown for over 500 years there. And it was under the branches of the Salem oak that the tradition has it that the Quaker, English Quaker John Fenwick had his first discussions and agreements for peace with the local branches of the Lenape who inhabited that area. The Salem oak, the DEP, offered a gift of a seedling of the Salem oak to all of New Jersey's municipalities in celebration of DEP's 50th birthday in 2020. No small feat, keeping in mind New Jersey has 565 some municipalities. But in that tradition of protecting our public health, of course, those plans had to be postponed in response to the public health emergency that broke out in 2020. So this year, we were finally able to plant our seedling, a few years delayed, however, coinciding with our anniversary as a museum in partnership with the Somerville Environmental Commission, and in a way as well with the international celebration of the Queen's Jubilee, an occasion marked with an initiative called Plant a Tree for the Jubilee. In the United Kingdom, the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy in the nations of the Commonwealth around the world. And this initiative was extended as a memorial tribute as well, following the demise of the Queen in September. So here's our superintendent not just the superintendent at the desk, but getting out there in the field, digging the hole so we could put our seedling there in the ground. And that leaves us here where we are today. And with our reflection on all of this past and history, we now assess and look ahead to 2026, the anniversary of New Jersey's first constitution, and 2028 to 29, the 250th anniversaries of Washington's own headquarters at the Wallace House. Revolution NJ is the statewide initiative here in New Jersey, and the State Park Service and the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association carry on those efforts. And like our forebears at the Revolutionary Memorial Society, we can always use more help, always use more interest, and even new members. So I hope you'll take that as your invitation to get involved, if not at our own historic site, in your own quarter of New Jersey, as we continue these efforts of preservation and conservation of our great parks, forests, and historic sites, and look for these upcoming anniversary years as an important moment to launch new initiatives with our own new perspectives on this history too. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you so much,
But a little
Paul.
bit longer, but at least got it right there at 1 o'clock. So, thanks so much for bearing with me, and I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Paul. Yeah, if anybody has any questions for Paul, we can certainly entertain them. But it's fascinating to learn about not only the history of the site as it became a recognized site, but also in the greater context of memorials and public history that was being revived then at the turn of the 20th century. So let's see. One question. The story I heard was that Frederick Frelinghuysen was the person that shot Colonel Rawl at Trenton.
You know, that is an excellent question. And I am learning more because by coincidence, just when I gave that detail about the Swan Foundation holding the coat, I believe that that is one of the stories or one of the claims, right? Is that Frederick Frelinghuysen was in the Battle of Trenton, and basically somehow because he shot Rawl is how he got possession of the coat. And the reason I'm saying that's interesting timing is just this Sunday I was out at our reenactment for the Battle of Princeton at Princeton Battlefield State Park, and was talking to one of my counterparts at Washington Crossing State Park, who of course works with the Swan Collection. And I've been giving this program in some form all through this past year and saying, I'd love to find out where Colonel Rawl's coat is, whether or not it actually is his coat. There was obviously some object in the Wallace House that they believed was his coat. And as far as I can tell, it's not here anymore. And he's the one who just told me on Sunday that, oh yeah, what happened to that was the Frelinghuysen's took it back and gave it to the Swan Collection. And so it's part of that collection today. So that is at least the lore provenance. You know, we know that there is a coat, right, that was on exhibit at the Wallace House. It was called Colonel Rawl's coat. And later, Kell Swan, who was the historian who did a lot of the work assembling this collection, the Swan Collection, he would basically come to an agreement with the Frelinghuysen's to remove the coat and put it in his collection. As far as the story and what is fact or fiction in that story, or at least what is that we can know and can't know for sure, I don't know. Yeah, whether or not Frederick Frelinghuysen himself shot Colonel Rawl, I do not know for sure. And I don't even know if we can ever know for sure. But I'd say I'd have to follow up with my counterparts there at Washington Crossing, who've done a lot of work, not just on that history, but also on the collection, which includes the purported coat. And they'd be the ones to ask. So I'm sorry that's not really an answer, but I'm continuing to learn all the time, and we'll see what we can figure out. But one object that I am curious about is still at the Wallace House today. We do have a chair that has a label on it, right, that says it was owned by Philemon Dickinson, whose home was the Hermitage, which is along Sullivan Way, right, along that approach that General Sullivan took to Trenton. And today it's no longer the 18th century building, to my knowledge, but a 19th century building that took its place is still standing. And in fact, is a multi-use apartment building. So kind of an interesting historic structure to consider. But yeah, this chair claims that it was in Philemon Dickinson's house during the battle or something. So how that got to our Wallace House, or whether or not there's any integrity, right? Obviously, just because someone put a label on it does not make it automatically true. Would be a fascinating one to pursue further. And the other one is the trunk. We've got a trunk, which I assume is the trunk they're referring to at the Wallace House today, but needs further investigation as well. Yeah, but they're interesting things to explore further.
The research for this talk must have taken a long time. What are some of the places you used to pull the information you presented here? I imagine it wasn't all from the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage files, but you might have looked elsewhere as well. Can you tell us a little about your research journey?
Yes, for sure. So actually, surprisingly, yeah, a lot of it, all these, most of the like the photocopied images I showed you are from two pamphlets that we have in our collection at the Wallace House, which I will rather grandly call archival, although there's still a lot of work to do to kind of properly archive them. The one pamphlet that comes from the 1898 lecture at the Newark Lyceum is kind of fun because basically we got like two boxes of these pamphlets, and it's just as if you had gone to a lecture today and they had a bunch of pamphlets left over, except these ones have happened to now sit around for over 120 years. But so we just got boxes of them, but they're now over 120 years old, which is kind of cool. And then the other one, which I have less copies of, but was like a circa 1930s pamphlet published by the Revolutionary Memorial Society. Another source that I showed you was that Unionist Gazette. The borough of Somerville has largely the collection of historic Somerville newspapers, and they've been carrying out various efforts through their historic advisory commission to either preserve them or digitize them, because those are really hyper local newspapers that don't survive in any kind of repositories anywhere else. And that's the one that carries the news of the opening. And I'll tell you the funny little secret was I wanted to do a royal thing anyway for the Jubilee. So I thought, well, here we go. We got an anniversary, we got a Jubilee, we'll do it. And then when we got this headline, I thought, well, now I actually have a real reason to do it. The Somerville people, the residents of Somerville themselves, when they opened the Wallace House and Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee was taking place, it made for a neat joint occasion. So then it became not just, our anniversary is during the Platinum Jubilee year, but guess what? Our opening was during the Diamond Jubilee year, and that kind of made for some neat subjects to follow. That's largely, I guess, the main sources of material. Some of the elements related to the Rockingham story, I did find elsewhere, I think through digitized newspapers. So I'd have to double check my notes to make sure I get those straight. And that's what's great about doing these talks. You always learn more preparing the talk, and then you gotta go make sure I update my records so that I keep my notes in order. But yeah, that was the first time I saw this reference to the Revolutionary Memorial Society being interested in Rockingham and basically saying, well, we don't want a moved house, we want an original house. So we're not doing this. But a few of their members sort of broke away and said, well, actually, this is still a worthwhile project, and founded it there. So primarily, actually, it was relying on those, some of the archival stuff that we've collected and accumulated over the years. That's just here at Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage to this day. But there are a few other sources where New Jersey material has been digitized. And I know there's still more out there to pursue. And now that I know the Washington Headquarters Association is associated, if accidentally, to the Revolutionary Memorial Society, I know they've got papers at the Historical Society of Princeton. I should probably check out sometime too.
What, if any, are the plans for the Royal Governor's Mansion in Perth Amboy?
Well, I'm not, it's not my direct portfolio, but I do know there are sort of parallel initiatives going on there. Today, the Royal Governor's Mansion. So by that is Proprietary House State Historic Site in Perth Amboy, which is the only surviving residence of a royal governor in the 13 colonies of British North America. Recall that the mansions at Williamsburg, and I think it's North Carolina, either North Carolina or South Carolina, those are reconstructions. Those were rebuilt in later years. The Proprietary House is the only one that still has its original fabric, although it has been very largely expanded, has a lot of 19th century additions to it as well. And I know that at the moment, the Proprietary House Association, who is really responsible for the interpretation of that historic site, leases it from the Department of Environmental Protection. They're working with the Crossroads of the American Revolution Association, which manages the Crossroads of the American Revolution National Heritage Area, on developing a use plan, I guess. In the past few years, they got through legislative appropriations, a lot of money to do some of the fabric work to at least shore up the historic structure. And now they're going to turn more to the detailed work of figuring out how to use the building. Only a few rooms are really used as museums. Parts in the past have actually been rented out as office space. And the plan is now they want to try to bring the whole building back together, and mostly as museum, but perhaps for some other what we call adaptive reuse as well. And they're trying to figure out the best way to do that. So it's a meaningful resource in Perth Amboy. Separate from that is although obviously related, is the Revolution NJ appropriation to fund work at state parks and historic sites related to the Revolution. And I believe that the latest $25 million appropriation, our governor has confirmed that Proprietary House, and in fact, Wallace House, are among the sites that will receive funding through that appropriation. All we know is that they're on the list. The exact breakdown of expenditures still remains to be determined, or at least released. But there's those kind of two efforts going on there. The Speaker of the General Assembly, Craig Coughlin, is an assemblyman from the district, including Perth Amboy, and has taken a particular interest in the Proprietary House as part of the upcoming American Revolution initiatives. Meanwhile, for us at the Wallace House, we've also worked to get some National Park Service grants and funding coming in, and we've at least been awarded one of those grants. And so hopefully we'll have some good work to show coming up in the next few years in terms of making sure these historic sites are fit, not just for the big topic is visitor readiness for the anniversaries, and obviously that's important, but also I want to make sure, serve visitors for the generations to come. And that's what we're trying to do with our Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association support as well. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved kind of in that effort, I'd say just look up Crossroads of the American Revolution and New Jersey Historical Commission are the public-private partners leading Revolution NJ. That's the name they've given to the statewide observance of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in New Jersey. And if you're interested in getting involved directly at the Wallace House, check out our Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage Association, wallacehouseassociation.org, or on social media, and you can find out how to learn about our efforts at that more local level of these two historic homes.
All righty. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we can go ahead and end it there. So I'd like to thank you again, Paul, for speaking, and I hope this was a great way to close out your jubilee of 125 years.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, great closeout, right? And just opens up the next chapter,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Preservation work. So I appreciate that invitation today. Thank you.
And thank you for everybody for attending today. This program is being recorded, so a link will be shared with everybody once it's available on our YouTube channel. So we look forward to having you at some of our future programs. So everybody be safe, be well, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Happy New Year. Thank you.